My stepsister ruined my life, so I cut off my family and took back my future. But this happened. The summer I turned 17 was the summer my life came undone. At the time, I didn't know it. I thought I was just being dragged along on another one of those family trips, those forced bonding experiences that were supposed to bring us closer but usually ended up as exercises in endurance. This time, it was Clearwater Beach, Florida. My dad, Michael, and stepmom, Deborah, had picked the destination, lured by a discount beach resort Deborah had found online. Clearwater wasn't anything close to what I wanted. It was hot, crowded, and noisy, the kind of place that seemed to hum with chaos at all hours. The air was thick with humidity, and the beaches were packed shoulder to shoulder with tourists. I would have preferred staying home, working my part-time job, and spending quiet evenings with my small group of friends. But refusing the trip wasn't an option. My dad didn't tolerate defiance, especially not from me. So there I was, wedged into the back seat of our car, trapped with my dad, Deborah, and her daughter, Ella, for hours. Ella was 14, and everything I wasn't: entitled, coddled, and adored. She thrived on attention and basked in the glow of her mother's constant doting. Deborah treated Ella like the center of her universe, and my dad, eager to keep the peace in his marriage, followed suit. Ella was their golden child, the baby who could do no wrong. I was just there. I wasn't the black sheep. I didn't rebel or act out, but I wasn't special either. I floated somewhere in the background, unnoticed and unremarkable. The tension between Ella and me was constant, like the static charge in the air before a storm. It wasn't that we fought all the time, it was more that we existed on completely different wavelengths. I didn't trust her, and she didn't like me. I think, in some unspoken way, we both understood this, and neither of us cared enough to change it. When we finally arrived at the resort, my mood plummeted further. The place was one of those budget hotels that looked glamorous in the promotional photos, but revealed its cracks in person. The hallways were dimly lit and smelled faintly of mildew. The rooms were small, the walls paper-thin, and the ocean view promised in the listing turned out to be a sliver of blue visible only if you craned your neck at the right angle. My dad and Deborah had their own room, of course, leaving me to share with Ella. It was a blow I hadn't anticipated, but I told myself I could endure it for a few days. How bad could it be? Ella wasted no time making sure I regretted that optimism. From the moment we unpacked, her disdain for me was palpable. She didn't need to say much. Her superiority oozed from every sigh, every roll of her eyes. She complained loudly about having to share a bathroom, shot me judgmental glances whenever I dared to speak, and generally made it clear that my presence was an inconvenience. By the second day, the tension exploded. I can't even remember what sparked the argument, something trivial, no doubt. Maybe I'd borrowed her hairbrush without asking, or maybe she'd taken too long in the bathroom when I needed a shower. Whatever it was, it escalated quickly. There was shouting, and then Ella hurled a pillow at me like a toddler mid-tantrum. I fired back with a cutting remark that I don't even remember now. What I do remember is the way she froze, her face twisting in anger, before deciding she was done with me entirely. From that moment on, she refused to speak to me. She ignored my existence for the rest of the trip. No good mornings, no acknowledgement when I asked her to pass the sunscreen. At first, I found it funny. If she wanted to ignore me, I was happy to return the favor. But as the trip dragged on, her silence began to feel less like a passive-aggressive tantrum and more like something calculated. When we returned home, Ella's cold shoulder didn't thaw. She carried on as though I didn't exist, walking past me in the hallway without a glance, skipping over me in conversations at dinner, and acting as though the air where I stood was empty. At first, I told myself it was just teenage dramatics. 14-year-olds could hold a grudge, right? Surely, she'd get over it. She didn't. Instead, the atmosphere in our house shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. My dad, who had always been distant but neutral, became colder. His conversations with me were clipped, his tone edged with disapproval I couldn't explain. Deborah, once indifferent, began watching me with sharp, probing eyes. It was like she was waiting for me to slip up, waiting for an excuse. At first, I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was imagining things. But the tension grew thicker with each passing day. Then came the invasions. One afternoon, I came home from school to find Deborah in my room, rifling through my drawers. When I confronted her, she barely offered an explanation, muttering something about checking something before leaving the room. I stared at the mess she'd left behind, feeling a mix of confusion and violation. What was she looking for? The whispers between my dad and Deborah became more frequent. I'd catch my name in their conversations, spoken in sharp, disapproving tones. My stomach churned every time I overheard them. Something was happening, and though I couldn't put my finger on it, I had a sinking feeling it had everything to do with Ella. The truth came crashing down one evening when my dad stormed into my room unannounced. His face was red with anger, and the accusations came tumbling out. Sneaking out at night, doing drugs, running with boys. It was so absurd that for a moment I thought he was joking. But he wasn't. Ella had spun an elaborate web of lies, and my dad believed every word. My protests, my attempts to defend myself, they didn't matter. He was deaf to reason, his mind already made up. From that moment on, I was treated like a criminal. My dad interrogated me daily, grilling me about my whereabouts and questioning everything I did. Deborah searched my room whenever I wasn't home, looking for evidence of the crimes they were convinced I'd committed. Ella, meanwhile, carried on like nothing had happened, smirking at me whenever no one else was looking. I couldn't understand why she was doing this to me. Was it revenge for our argument? A bid for attention? Or something deeper, something darker? Whatever her motives, the damage was done. My once stable, unremarkable life had spiraled into chaos, and I was powerless to stop it. Every day felt like a battle, a slow unraveling of my sanity. The accusations were constant, little jabs that chipped away at me piece by piece. It didn't matter what I said or how fervently I denied Ella's lies. In their minds, I was already guilty. And Ella, she just stood by, watching it all unfold with that infuriatingly smug smile. I couldn't make sense of it. What had I done to make her hate me so much? Had this resentment been festering all along, hidden beneath the surface, or was this some twisted form of revenge for our petty argument? Whatever her reasons, she had won. She'd planted a seed of distrust so deep in my dad and Deborah's minds that I couldn't undo it. The worst part wasn't their suspicion or the constant questioning. It was the isolation. I felt completely alone. My friends were more like acquaintances, people I sat with at lunch, coworkers I joked around with during shifts. But none of them were close enough for me to confide in, and even if they were, what would I say? How could I explain that my stepsister had convinced my parents I was sneaking out, doing drugs, and throwing my life away? Who would even believe me? So I stayed silent. I withdrew into myself, speaking to my dad and Deborah only when absolutely necessary. I avoided the house as much as I could, coming home late from school or picking up extra shifts at work. When I was home, I stayed locked in my room, eating dinner alone, and avoiding their judgmental stares. The house stopped feeling like home. I was a ghost in my own life, tiptoeing through a place I used to belong. But no matter how much distance I tried to create, it didn't stop the escalation. One night, I came home late from school after staying back to finish a group project. As soon as I walked through the door, my dad was there, waiting in the hallway like a predator lying in wait. His eyes were dark, his jaw tight. Before I could even set down my bag, he barked out, "Where were you?" Caught off guard, I froze. I explained I'd been at school, working on the project, even offering to show him emails from my teacher if he needed proof. But it didn't matter. Ella had already set her trap. He shouted that she'd told him I'd been sneaking out earlier in the day. I stood there, stunned, as he ranted about how I was throwing my life away. And then he said it. "You're a disgrace." The word hit like a punch to the gut. My voice shook as I tried to defend myself, to explain that Ella was lying. I even asked why he believed her over me, but that only made things worse. His rage boiled over, his fists clenching at his sides as if he was holding himself back from something worse. Finally, he turned and walked away, leaving me trembling and blinking back tears. That night, I realized the truth. It didn't matter what I said. It didn't matter how much I tried to prove my innocence. They had already made up their minds. Ella had poisoned them against me, and I was powerless to undo the damage. The next morning, Deborah stopped me before I left for school, her tone sharp and condescending. She warned me about facing consequences if I didn't shape up, her words dripping with a kind of disappointment that made my stomach churn. Her threat hung over me like a cloud for days. What consequences? What more could they possibly do to me? Every time I passed Ella in the hallway, she flashed me that same smug grin, as if to remind me who was really in control. It felt like she was playing a game I didn't even know I was part of, a game she was determined to win at any cost. I couldn't take it anymore. I started staying at school as late as I could, lingering long after the halls had emptied, just to avoid going home. But no matter how much I tried to escape, the damage had already been done. My dad and Deborah saw me as a lost cause, and Ella just kept twisting the knife. The night my dad kicked me out is burned into my memory. It was late, close to midnight, and I had stayed at school working on a project. I knew the second I stepped through the door that it was going to be a problem. My dad was waiting in the hallway, his face flushed with anger. He demanded to know where I had been, his voice loud enough to shake the walls. Exhausted, I told him the truth. I'd been at school. I even offered to show him proof, but he didn't care. Ella had already whispered her lies, this time about me sneaking out with some guy. My heart sank. I tried to explain, to deny it, but he was beyond reason. His face turned a dangerous shade of red as he slammed his hand down on the kitchen counter, the sound reverberating through the house. Then, in a voice so low and controlled it terrified me, he told me to get out. "You're a disgrace," he said again, the words colder and sharper than before. I froze, unable to process what was happening. When I realized he wasn't backing down, I numbly grabbed a bag and started stuffing it with clothes and essentials. My hands trembled as tears streamed down my face. As I passed Ella's bedroom, she stood in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame with that same smug expression. She didn't say a word, but her look said everything. I won. I couldn't even look at her. I walked out into the night, my chest heavy with anger, sadness, and betrayal. For the next few days, I crashed on my friend Jessica's couch. We weren't especially close, but when I texted her saying I had nowhere else to go, she didn't hesitate to offer her place. I didn't tell her everything. How could I? The whole story was too ugly, too humiliating. All I told her was that things at home had gotten bad, and I needed time to figure things out. Those days were some of the longest of my life. I felt numb, like I was floating through the world in a haze. I'd go to work, go to school, and then return to Jessica's place, where I'd curl up under a scratchy blanket and stare at the ceiling until I finally drifted into a restless sleep. I had no plan, no direction, and no idea how to move forward. All I knew was that the life I'd known had crumbled, and I had no way of putting the pieces back together. My dad never called. Deborah never called. Ella probably celebrated. I had no doubt she basked in her victory, thrilled that her lies had driven me out for good. As the days passed, the silence from them was deafening, a harsh confirmation of where I stood in their world. After a week of crashing on Jessica's couch, I knew I couldn't stay there forever. Jessica had been kind, but I didn't want to overstay my welcome. I needed a place of my own, no matter how humble. I found a tiny, rundown studio apartment in a crumbling part of town. The rent was dirt cheap, and it was all I could afford with the small savings I'd scraped together from my part-time job. The walls were paper-thin, the floor tiles were cracked, and the bathroom's sink leaked incessantly. The heater rattled, the faucet dripped, and the single window overlooked a grimy alley. But it was mine. For the first time in my life, I had my own space, no Ella, no accusations, no judgmental stares. I thought I'd feel free, but mostly, I just felt empty. I settled into a new routine over the next few months. I picked up more shifts at work, pouring coffee and flipping burgers at the diner just to make ends meet. My meals were mostly instant ramen or whatever I could find on sale. Weekends were spent studying at the library because I couldn't afford Wi-Fi. It was a far cry from the life I'd imagined for myself, but it was better than the nightmare I'd left behind. At night, though, it was harder to escape. As I lay in the creaky twin bed I'd scavenged from a thrift store, the memories would resurface.
Ella smirked.
My dad's furious accusations. Deborah rummaging through my belongings like a detective searching for evidence. Over and over, I'd ask myself the same questions. Why had Ella done it? Why had my dad believed her without question? What had I done to deserve being cast out like that? But the answers never came. The pain was raw, and the silence in my apartment only amplified it. Eventually, life moved on. I graduated high school by the skin of my teeth, my grades barely holding together under the weight of everything I'd been dealing with. But I finished. That alone felt like an accomplishment. After graduation, I landed a better-paying job as a server at a busier diner downtown. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Slowly, I started to save a little money, tucking away what I could for a future I hadn't fully envisioned yet. For the first time, I let myself dream of something better. And then I met Ryan. Ryan wasn't the kind of guy I thought I'd end up with. He was steady, kind, and patient, a far cry from the chaos I was used to. He came into the diner one afternoon with a group of friends, ordered pancakes, and cracked a joke about the syrup that caught me off guard. I laughed, despite myself. I didn't think much of him at first, but he kept coming back. Always sitting in my section. Always smiling at me like I was the best part of his day. After a few weeks, he finally asked me out. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't in a place where I felt like I could give anyone anything. I was still struggling to pay rent, still haunted by the ghosts of my past. But Ryan didn't seem to care. He saw me, really saw me, in a way no one had in years. For the first time, I felt like I mattered to someone. Ryan never pushed me to open up about my family. I told him bits and pieces, just enough to explain why I didn't have a relationship with them. He didn't pry. Instead, he held my hand when I needed it and made me laugh when I felt like crying. With him, I started to build a life that wasn't defined by Ella's lies or my dad's betrayal. For the first time in years, I felt hope. Then one day, out of nowhere, I got a message from Liam. Liam had been Ella's high school boyfriend, someone I hadn't thought about in years. Seeing his name pop up on my phone sent a jolt through me. I debated ignoring it. I didn't want anything to do with Ella or anyone connected to her. But curiosity won out. The message was brief. Hey Hannah, I know it's been a long time, but there's something you need to know about Ella. My heart started pounding as I typed back. What are you talking about? His response came quickly, and when I read it, my hands began to shake. He said Ella had confessed everything to him, that she'd lied about me all those years ago. She'd admitted to making up the stories about me sneaking out and doing drugs because she was jealous. She thought I was getting too much attention from guys and couldn't handle it. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. After all these years, the truth was finally out. Ella had destroyed my life over something so petty, so insignificant. All the pain, the isolation, the nights I'd cried myself to sleep, it had all been because of her jealousy. I wanted to scream. I wanted to march to my dad's house and shove this confession in his face, to make him see how wrong he'd been to believe her. But what would it change? Would it bring back the years I'd lost? Would it undo the hurt they'd caused? The answer was no. Liam offered to back me up if I wanted to confront her. But I didn't want to. I felt exhausted, not empowered. So I blocked his number, deleted the messages, and tried to push it all down. But the weight of it stayed with me, simmering beneath the surface. Life moved on, but the anger lingered. I tried to forget about Liam's message, telling myself it didn't matter anymore. Ella's confession didn't erase the years of damage. My dad and Deborah had chosen to believe her lies over my truth, and no amount of proof could undo that betrayal. By the time I was in my early 20s, Ryan and I had built a life together. We moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was ours. I was working as a supervisor at the diner, and Ryan had started doing carpentry work for a local contractor. He was steady and reliable, and he made me feel safe in a way I hadn't felt since I was a child. I rarely thought about my family during those years. It hurt too much to dwell on everything that had happened. Whenever Ryan asked about them, I'd brush it off with vague answers. We're not close, or it's complicated. He never pressed, and I was grateful for that. Then, one afternoon, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but something in me told me to pick up. When the call came, I answered hesitantly. The voice on the other end was unmistakable, even after all these years. It was my father. 5 years had passed since I'd last heard from him, but time had softened none of the sting his voice brought. He sounded older, worn down by life, with a weight in his tone that hadn't been there before. The sound of him stirred conflicting emotions, anger, sadness, and a fleeting, unwelcome glimmer of hope. He said he needed to talk, that it was important. My instinct was to hang up, to cut him off and bury the pain his words dredged up. But curiosity clawed its way to the surface, overriding my better judgment. I agreed to meet him, unsure if I wanted to hear what he had to say, or if I simply needed closure. We met at a small coffee shop in the city, a neutral ground I chose, so I could leave if the conversation went where I feared it might. When I arrived, I saw him sitting in the corner, clutching his coffee like it was the only thing anchoring him to the room. He looked older than I remembered, his hair streaked with gray, his face lined with deep creases that told a story of time and regret. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize him. I approached cautiously, my guard firmly in place. He smiled faintly when he saw me, a hesitant gesture that seemed to crumble under the weight of the tension between us. I sat down across from him, crossing my arms and waiting for him to speak. The silence between us was thick and uncomfortable, charged with years of unresolved pain. Eventually, he broke the silence. He admitted he had spoken to Ella and had learned the truth, that she had lied about me all those years ago. The accusations she'd made, the stories about sneaking out and doing drugs, had all been fabrications born out of jealousy. He said she confessed it all, explaining that she'd been envious of the attention she thought I was getting. He admitted he had believed her without question, and his regret was palpable. Hearing those words hit me like a tidal wave. The validation I had craved for so long was finally in front of me, but it didn't bring the relief I thought it would. Instead, anger surged through me, bubbling up from the years of betrayal, loneliness, and rejection. I thought of all the nights I had cried myself to sleep, all the moments I doubted myself because my father couldn't see the truth. He said he was sorry, that he had failed me, but his words felt like ashes in my mouth. The years of hurt poured out of me, years of being cast aside and treated like a liar, years of being abandoned when I needed him most. I laid bare the pain of what his choices had done to me, how they had shaped the life I was forced to build from the wreckage. I told him it wasn't just about the lies Ella told. It was about how he believed her over me, how he had refused to question her and thrown me away without a second thought. He sat there, shoulders slumped, taking in every word I hurled at him. His regret was written in every line of his face, but it wasn't enough. It was too little, too late. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, only that he wanted me to know he finally understood what he had done. He still saw me as his daughter, he said, and he didn't want to lose me completely. But I had already been lost to him years ago, and no apology could undo that. The emptiness inside me swallowed any hope of reconciliation. I told him I didn't know if I could forgive him, or even if I wanted to try. His expression fell further, but he didn't argue. He seemed to know he had no right to. We sat in silence after that, the weight of what had been said hanging between us. When I finally stood to leave, he didn't try to stop me. He simply sat there, staring into his coffee, as though it might offer him answers he would never find. For a while after that, I heard nothing from him. I thought perhaps that was the end of it, that this long and painful chapter of my life was finally closed. Ryan and I moved forward with planning our wedding, focusing on building a life that felt beautiful and whole. I had decided early on not to invite Ella. Her confession, no matter how late, didn't erase what she had done or the years of suffering she had caused. Ryan agreed completely, telling me I owed her nothing. The decision to invite my father and Deborah, however, was more complicated. Despite everything, a small part of me wanted them to see the life I had built without them. I wanted them to understand that their absence hadn't broken me. But, as always with my family, nothing went smoothly. A week after the invitations were sent, my father called again. His voice was tense, and my heart sank the moment I answered. He said Ella had asked why she wasn't invited to the wedding. My stomach churned. Of course, it was about her. He sighed heavily when I explained that she wasn't invited. The weight of his disapproval hung in the air between us, and I braced myself for what was to come. The call left me shaken in a way I hadn't expected. My father's insistence that I invite Ella to my wedding struck a nerve, though it wasn't surprising. He explained that Ella was sorry for what she had done and had been trying to make amends. He thought it was unfair of me to exclude her, as if her lies, the betrayal, and the years of pain they caused could simply be swept away with an apology. The weight of his words pressed on my chest, but it wasn't guilt, it was anger. Fairness. That word echoed in my mind long after I hung up the phone. Had it been fair when Ella tore my life apart? Was it fair when I was kicked out of the house because of her lies? It had always been about her, her needs, her wants, her ability to manipulate those around her. Even now, after everything, they still chose her. They still put her first. I sat on the couch, fists clenched in my lap, replaying the conversation in my head. My heart ached, not because I doubted my decision, but because the cycle felt unbreakable. No matter what I did, I would always be the outsider in my own family. Ryan, sensing my distress, sat beside me and wrapped an arm around my shoulders. His presence grounded me, reminding me of the life we were building together. A life where I didn't have to fight for love or acceptance. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, I tried to focus on the joy of what was to come. Ryan's family embraced me in ways I hadn't thought possible. They were supportive and kind, genuinely excited for us. His mother fussed over every detail, ensuring the decorations were perfect. His father worked with Ryan to build a stunning wooden arch for the ceremony. His brother, Mark, even offered to walk me down the aisle. Their love and enthusiasm filled a void I hadn't realized was so deep, and yet, beneath the surface, I couldn't fully let go of the ache left by my own family's absence. Part of me held onto a sliver of hope that my father might change his mind. Maybe he would show up at the wedding, finally ready to put me first. But as the days ticked by and his silence stretched on, I knew better than to hope. The morning of the wedding, I woke up feeling a mixture of nerves and calm. As I stood before the mirror, dressed in soft ivory that glowed in the morning light, I saw a version of myself I hadn't recognized in years. I looked happy. For once, the reflection staring back at me wasn't shadowed by pain or doubt. When the ceremony began, Mark walked me down the aisle, steady and reassuring. The moment I saw Ryan waiting for me, every ounce of stress and sadness melted away. The sun shone brightly, the flowers were in full bloom, and the people who mattered most surrounded us. As we exchanged our vows, I felt a deep, unshakable peace settle over me. For years, I had allowed my family's betrayal to define me, but standing there with Ryan, I realized I didn't need my father's approval or Ella's apology to be happy. I was free, truly free, for the first time in my life. Life after the wedding was quiet, blissfully so. Ryan and I settled into married life, finding comfort in the rhythms of our days. My father didn't call, Deborah didn't send messages, and Ella stayed away entirely. It was as though the storm had finally passed, leaving me with the peace I'd been chasing for so long. But as always with my family, the quiet didn't last. A month after the wedding, a long, rambling text from Deborah shattered the silence. She spoke about how much they missed me, how Ella was sorry for what she had done, and how I needed to let it go for the sake of the family. The sheer audacity of it almost made me laugh. After everything they had put me through, they thought forgiveness was something I could hand out like an afterthought, as though years of pain could simply be erased. I didn't respond. A week later, my father sent an email. It was short and to the point, saying they missed me and wanted to talk. I stared at it for a long time, sadness and anger churning inside me. Why was it always on me to make things right? Why was I expected to reach out, to forgive, to fix the fractures they had caused? I had given them chance after chance, and every time they had let me down. The weight of their expectations no longer felt like mine to carry. I didn't respond to that message either. Instead, I blocked their numbers, deleted their emails, and finally allowed myself to let go of the burden I had carried for so long. This time, there would be no second chances. Ryan reassured me I was doing the right thing, that I didn't owe them anything. His words echoed what I had finally come to understand. I deserved to be happy without their toxicity dragging me down. For the first time, I felt truly free. I had spent so many years chasing after their approval, trying to make them see my side of things, only to realize it didn't matter. Their choices weren't mine to control, and their inability to love me unconditionally wasn't my failure. I had Ryan. I had his family. I had the life we were building together. That was enough. Letting go of my family wasn't easy. It's never easy to walk away from people you once thought would always be there. But sometimes, the people who hurt you the most are the ones you have to leave behind. My happiness, my peace, and my future were worth so much more than their validation. As I moved forward, I stopped looking back. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be.